underway with regards to the actions that have been identified, both in the Auditor General's report, the Ombudsman's report, and there's a management action plan that has been put in place by those departments.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, President. Merci, cher témoin.
Turning now to Ms. Bradford. You have the floor for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you to the witnesses for coming in today. I know the Auditor General's Department has been before numerous committees and numerous meetings on this very issue, and it is taking up an inordinate amount of your valuable time. So I do appreciate you coming back again. And to the Treasury Board, we are most anxious to hear from you today. So I will be directing my questions to the Treasury Board because we've had the AG's office here, as I said, multiple times. I'm not sure which of you will have the answers to these questions, so I would just encourage the most appropriate staff member to respond with the answer. So can you describe what procurement measures were brought in during the pandemic? And did these changes have an impact on the issue we are discussing today?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. And correct me if I don't understand your question correctly. But during the pandemic, obviously, and I think a previous member said it, it was clear in the Auditor General's report, the pandemic was not an excuse to do things frivolously, I would say. So during the pandemic, there was an understanding that departments and people would need to react quickly, and most likely in some cases, in order to deliver in this quick fashion, that maybe the control frameworks that would usually be followed would not be followed as usual. The direction that was provided to departments on many instances was that although we recognize that, and I had a chat with the then interim Auditor General about it, in light of that, the importance became the documentation, making sure that if you are going to make a decision and some controls will be foregone, to document the rationale of your decision and to document any compensating controls that you would have put in place. For example, if normally you would have a front-end controls that your activity would go through, and maybe in light of time and the speed of action that you need to take, maybe you're going to build in a back-end control to make sure that you have the controls in place to at least validate the accuracy of what you're doing. So again, during the pandemic, there was a recognition that we would have to operate in some instances outside of those controls, but thus the importance of documenting the decisions and the controls, the compensating controls that we would have in place.
Right. So clearly one of the problems was that documentation was not done and those records don't exist. And that's why the AG has a lot of difficulty in actually even determining how much this application did cost at the end of the day. It's kind of her best guess because of the poor record keeping. So while the Treasury Board does have measures in place for procurement, it's clear that they weren't followed. And what is being done to ensure compliance in CBSA, for example, and across the government more broadly?
So what I could say is that the Auditor General's report is being taken extremely seriously. We're looking at all options right now. So there are the CBSA issue that we know of right now. We know that they've been audited by different parties at the moment, and they have an action plan to deal with this. We're also looking, as you noted, my worry as the Controller General is that I need to provide myself some assurance that the weaknesses that were noted, for example, in this audit, is something that could be viewed as mainly isolated. So we're looking at different options right now, trying to prepare a plan to see, what we will be doing to ensure compliance to the procurement policies and rules that should be respected.
Now, what role do ministers play in contracting and procurement? Like, did any minister sign off on any of these contracts?
So I haven't been privy to, like I said, I didn't audit the contracts. I don't believe in these particular cases. Okay, I see the Auditor General nodding, so she's agreeing with what I'm going to say. But yeah, I don't think these particular contracts were signed by the minister. So the departments operate within a set of authorities that are delegated to them, most of them through the minister, then sub-delegated to the deputy minister, and then to assistant deputy ministers, onto managers, for example. When you sign something, it comes with an accountability. So these authorities that are delegated within an organization, when someone signs, for example, on Section 34, that is there to certify that work has been done. It's been done in line with the contract, in line with the price of the contract. That's your accountability, and you need to take that very seriously. So these accountabilities are delegated throughout an organization, and like I said, people have to be conscious of their responsibilities in discharging these authorities.
Thank you for that. And what role did the Treasury Board play in the creation of the ArriveCAN app?
To my knowledge, direct involvement in the actual creation of the app, that was done under the authorities of the department. Again, our role was to ensure that the rules were there. We have procurement policies. We, at the beginning of the pandemic, the Auditor General mentioned a note to all departments from the Secretary of the Treasury Board. I've also told you that I had discussions with the then interim Auditor General, because we knew that the processes may not be followed as usual. So again, our role was to make sure that people understood that should you forego the normal processes or control, that documentation was the key here. And I also own the internal audit function. So I did I've asked deputy ministers to use their internal auditors at the maximum to make sure that the documentation was going to be there and be sound. In case of an audit. We knew there was going to be audits on this, so you got to prepare yourself for these audits.
Thank you very much. Maintenant, Madame Sécla-Desgagnés.
Ms. Sécla-Desgagnés, 6 minutes. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairperson, and thank you to the witness for being here today. We've already heard some very interesting things, and I'd like to issue a reminder about what's said on the Government of Canada's website. The Treasury Board Secretariat of Canada provides advice and recommendations to the Treasury Board on how the government invests in programs and services, as well as the way that it upholds regulations and management requirements. First question, do you feel that the recommendations and the Council of the Treasury Board was properly followed when it comes to ArriveCAN? Response. Well, obviously, if I base my response on the comments of the Auditor General, the answer is no. She wrote in black and white that the policies were not followed. And as I explained earlier, in exceptional circumstances, such as a pandemic, documentation nevertheless has to be provided. Thank you very much. What is the use of recommendations and advice if those recommendations and advice are not followed? Response. Had there been no directives, the Auditor General would have noted it, and there would have been a recommendation that there was not the proper regulations. Accountability is important. The basis of that accountability is solid directives and solid policies. Therefore, public servants and others must follow them. Failing that, there needs to be mediation. And in the case of this audit, we've noticed a number of shortcomings and weaknesses, and we are doing our utmost to ensure that this does not occur going forward again. In your opinion, the Treasury Board did its job. It issued its policies. Whether or not those policies were followed, well, you just wash your hands of that. Is that the way it works? Response, well, we did our job, yes. But of course, we're open to feedback. When we see audits of this kind of scope and size, the Auditor General clearly said that this is not one of the most glamorous audits she's seen, and we take that very seriously. So we're looking at this issue. We need to revise our policies and our directives in order to bolster the processes. There were previous audits and we issued additional manuals to do with the use of professional services, for example, in order to direct government officials such that they take the right decisions and consult the right documentation. And I'm referring to those to whom the responsibility is delegated. So rules must be followed. Who ensures that the rules must be followed? The buck stops with who in that respect? Well, there's different levels of accountability. we're responsible to ensure that there are solid rules in place. We have an accountability model that is decentralised across the Canadian bureaucracy, and that means, as I said earlier, there are delegated authorities to the departments, and under the Financial Administration Act, there's an important thing to note here, and that is that deputy ministers, and I'll say this in English, I'm sorry, they're the accounting officers, and it's written in black and white in the legislation that deputy ministers have an onus on them to ensure that there are proper control mechanisms in place and to ensure that their programs are delivered in keeping with the policies. So in the case of the Canada Border Service Agency, the buck stops with the president of the CBSA. The onus is on him to ensure that the recommendations and advice of the Treasury Board are followed. Is that correct? Response. Well, there's a whole system. Obviously, the Deputy Minister can't lay eyes on every single contract that goes through the department, but they must ensure that there are controls in place, that there's a government system, and that those controls are checked and double-checked on a regular basis to ensure that things are working as they should. Now, you must be aware that controls are never 100% fail-proof. Sometimes there will be weaknesses and vulnerabilities detected, but the purpose of the controls is to ensure that programs and initiatives that are delivered by departments are in keeping with the rules, regulations, legislation and policies. Thank you very much. We heard earlier, I think it was yesterday, in fact, we're hearing a lot of new things, but the representative from the Financial Association of Canada said that there were individuals, financial officers within the CBSA who were witness to conduct with which they did not disagree, that they raised red flags, that there was no follow-up to those red flags. So even when there are financial officers placed within departments and agencies, their concerns fall on deaf ears. How is it possible that there are controls, advice, directives, recommendations, policies, there are financial officers whose responsibility is to ensure that those processes are upheld, and at the end of the day, they're not? How is that possible? I'm sure that there are some levels of control that are working, but the fact of the matter is that ArriveCan is probably the tip of the iceberg. You know, there are obviously internal controls that have not been put in place, that have not been upheld. How did this actually occur, in your opinion? Response. I listened to Mr. Richard's testimony yesterday, and I know him quite well. I meet often with him, and I have a lot of time for him. Now, I don't know the nature of the complaints per se, but I find what occurred deplorable if one is to rely on what was said. And, you know, I have had experience with financial officers in departments for a period of 8 years. And if an individual raises a red flag and blows the whistle, I can tell you that there are normal steps that are followed, procedures that are followed. And the directors and supervisors of these individuals would have of course, address the issues at hand. But clearly, there is a solid financial basis of control within the federal government. If you look at financial statements that follow the proper procedures and have done so for the past quarter century. So it is unfortunate that in this particular case, there were controls that were not put in place or not followed, unfortunately. Thank you very much. Mr. McPherson.
You have the floor for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and nice to be on this committee with everyone today. This is not my normal committee, so I'm eager to be able to participate, and I do want to thank all of the witnesses for being here today with us. Like many of the witness or the members of Parliament who have spoken before me, I'm quite horrified by the report. And on behalf of the constituents that I represent in Edmonton Strathcona, I want to express my thanks to you, Ms. Hogan, for this comprehensive report. It's shocking, but it's important information that you've provided for parliamentarians, so I'm very grateful. When I look at the report, however, I'm alarmed, frankly, that we have a procurement system in this country that is so vulnerable and that it has been